The member for Bowman.
Deputy Speaker, far from this being a Labor lament tonight, I'd like to give an opportunity for the member for Hunter to respond by interjection to the wonderful analogy that he gave of a family whose power bills rise by $100 a month, only to be compensated by $100. And if they work hard, they can get their power bill down by $20 and somehow keep $20. Well, I put to him, why does someone who doesn't experience the Gillard churn work hard to get their power bill down and save on their power bill $20? And I will wait there with an opportunity for the member for Hunter to interject.
There will be no interjections, and I ask the member for Bowman to continue.
I invite an interjection, but I'm unable to get one. How he is any better off, $20 better off,
Order.
and someone who
the member for Bowman
churn
will keep his speech
is still $20 better off. It's a classic example of Gillard churn outlined for you by the government. And let Hansard record that I waited 15 seconds for that interjection, but none came. And just as he has also explained that he emphasises workforce participation, he has a colleague, the former Minister of Workforce Participation, who actually instructed, through departmental communication we understand, his departmental officers not to pursue mutual obligation in remote Australia. And as a result of that, we've seen deployment rates, program rates throughout Central Australia fall away and unemployment rates to be as high as they ever have been. Now, this is not about plumbing the depths of government incompetence. This is about recording for posterity what this administration will be remembered for. And when they write the history of the Gillard administration, it will be very hard to hide anywhere and record a successful outcome. And as I meander almost through a series of policy failures, I mean, surely this chamber must be fatigued listening to it. But Australians out there genuinely are sick of the waste. Now, that notion of primum non nocere, that idea that first we do no harm, is just as valid for governments as it should be for the medical profession. We can understand that there will always be, member for Oxley, a little bit of redistribution. But the one thing that Australians would ask is, if you're going to take some money from me and give to someone else, just try and do it effectively. And then they might even ask, try and do it efficiently, so that we don't lose too much in the process. But the last thing that they would ever want is that to be done wastefully or for it to be done in a way that causes damage, which is what we've seen over the last 5 years. And as we discussed the budget that actually forgot that there was even a carbon tax occurring this year, what we saw was tricky arithmetic to try and create a paper future surplus without any answer to Australians about when the debt will be paid off. And the frank reality is, Deputy Speaker, that this is yet another Labor administration quite content to run significant, medium-sized structural government debt. And this is a government utterly comfortable about doing it. Of course, not to admit it prior to election, but now that they're here, we can see that, like the Keating government before them, they're quite happy with a 10% of GDP debt running forever. Now, that's fine if the government's prepared to do that, but they also have to be able to protect the citizenry when the time comes. So what exactly did this government do when faced with the GFC? This was the get-out-of-jail-free card for the former Prime Minister to spend, spend and spend, and we're still paying the price. And if we're going to look at the school halls program and see $16 billion that this government blithely says we've invested into schools, but what could we have bought with that money, Deputy Speaker? We can only begin to imagine. And the Education Shadow Minister has been quite right. What he said is $16 billion could have bought so much more than just one school hall. It could have built enormous libraries and education and science facilities where there are none. I mean, there's not even a concrete slab there. We saw halls put next to halls. We saw dreadful outcomes that no government should be forgiven for doing. When we look at the NBN, we again saw some very tricky balance sheet reporting by using a 1997 CAC Act to call the NBN an investment, and therefore it doesn't appear on the bottom line. I mean, that's an extraordinary piece of Treasury trickery to hide what is in effect a massive, massive investment from the eyes and from the scrutiny of ordinary Australians. We know it's a massive investment, and Australians are right just to say what is going to be the return. It's now obvious that the government doesn't really know, but having initially promised a $5 billion program and then upped it to 50, they're utterly compelled to roll this thing out. Now, no one's going to start bagging fibre No one from this side is going to criticise the idea that we all want faster broadband. But I think Australians are asking, and on their behalf we as an opposition do, we simply want to see the cost-benefit. We're not interested in the private good for those who enjoy gaming or other activities using fast broadband. We'd just like to see where the public good lies, because it's utterly appropriate for a government to pay for what delivers a public good that otherwise the private sector could not provide. I mean, that is the job of government. So all we're asking of the Labor administration in 2011 is show us the public good derived from NBN. Now, the answer usually is we can't show you because we don't know what it is. Don't worry about it, it's all about to come. So why don't we turn our attention to the nations that have rolled out an NBN equivalent and just see whether South Korea has been transformed by fast broadband? And the answer is not overly. When you look in parts of Europe, the sign-up rates are remarkably low. And as wireless surges through, we don't speak ill of broadband by fibre. We simply say that as younger generations demand more mobility and smart handheld devices, wireless will become increasingly important. By no means a substitutable good, but will become more important, and it will make it harder for the NBN to recoup the loss of an early and expensive rollout. It's a simple question, and I think a government deserves that answer to its people, but it's an answer that we didn't receive in the budget, and we'll have to wait another year while this NBN is rolled out in political deployments in marginal seats around the country, and if people don't sign up unless it's given to them for free, there's no better indication of just how much something is valued than if the only way you can get someone to take it is give it away. And this NBN sign-up package that is so cheap it doesn't reflect the cost of rolling it out is your first evidence, your first irrefutable evidence that the NBN rollout is occurring so early in many of these areas where take-up rates are low that of course you're not going to be able to get a return for decades. So I put to this government, roll it out when people want it. Don't roll it out when the press release demands it, because that's what the NBN was. It was a flight between two capital cities, dreamt up, came up with a figure, and by gosh, they are not going to stop until it's rolled out or someone stops them. And of course, these highly paid executives on obscene salaries, which really does spit in the eye of anyone from Labor politics who thinks that executives should not be paid obscene salaries. But it's been done, and it's been with a nod of assent and a nod of approval provided to these NBN executives who, make no mistake, it's not hard to find someone who's going to head up the NBN. I mean, it's quite easy simply to turn to ex-Labor staffers and nominate someone and give them this obscene six-figure salary. Absolutely. Just as it was when time came to privatise New South Wales Power and 3 potentially Labor supporters needed to top up to their superannuation. So $1.4 million later for 6 months' work, we had privatised New South Wales Power. So it's a recurring habit at both Labor jurisdictions. So from the NBN to the carbon tax to school halls, and as I said, this is not intended in any way to be a Labor lament. I am effectively an opposition member searching for something good, just a morsel of goodness that's come out of this administration to take home to my own constituents and say, they're not all bad. I know cost of living's gone up 63% in 5 years, but they're not all bad over there. I mean, I would love to go back into my electorate newsletter and say there's a little bit of good on both sides of politics, there's good ideas on both sides, as Killen said, there's good cricket players in both teams, but just show me something that I can take back to my people who are paying more for food, more for power, more for fuel, that this government is heading in the right direction. Well, let's take the carbon taxes case par excellence. It is not a debate about whether we care about the environment, nor even if we want to reduce emissions. This is an argument of timing. It's an argument of whether it's Australia's national interest to move now compared to the global interest. Or does, by waiting and potentially having to have a larger program, do we move with the rest of the world and do it more effectively? It's a debate about national interest. It's why we fly to Canberra. It's to debate national interest. I mean, one side of politics doesn't have a greater love of carbon emissions, for goodness sake. We just want to do it at the right time when it works best. So I put a challenge to the opposition over here. Name me one major ore exporting, commodity exporting economy that's signed up for a carbon tax. Just give me one. And again I invite, but I hear nothing but silence, because the closest you might come up with is New Zealand. With all that energy-intensive milk production and growing apples, I mean, you can see why a carbon tax would devastate their economy. But of course they exempted all of their own sectors, didn't they? So what we see in a few selected economies outside the EU is a Swiss cheese carbon tax that exempts anything that is of any value. Absolutely. And that's why they'll sign up to a carbon tax. But the reality is, and when you look across the OECD, looking for the commodity exporting wealthy competitors who will take our jobs without a blink, none of them are moving towards a carbon tax. Now, there will be a time potentially when they do, and let's have a debate then about how we do it together. It's not a matter that we're a small economy and we're only 2% of emissions. No, it's the carbon leakage. It's what you do to the price of an Australian-made car compared to a Chinese-imported car. Did we get an answer from the Prime Minister on that? No, we didn't. Was it mentioned in the budget? No. Was there a massive big smokescreen around the carbon tax? YES. I mean, completely unwilling to talk about the challenges to working Australians who have become the forgotten Australians, and instead we have these Garnaut reports that are foisted upon the media gallery because these are the issues that no one believes the government has credibility to talk about. And I have some considerable sympathy for Professor Garnaut, a hard-working economist who is driven by a passion. But I would respectfully put, I would like to see one more report from Professor Garnaut. Don't retire yet.
No,
Give me one more report, Professor Garnaut, about how you will personally pay for the disadvantaged working Australians who are left out of pocket when they're not compensated adequately. Because the bottom line is no one knows how working Australians will be compensated because our Prime Minister cannot and will not tell us. We get these vague promises about all of the receipts from the carbon tax reimbursing vulnerable Australians, but there's no detail, and how can you possibly have a debate in this chamber when we do not know how ordinary working families will be affected? So I have another government member who's entered the room. So again I put a basic question to Australians. Two working families, both with workers, single income, at a cannery. One lives next door and walks to work. One commutes 40 kilometres to get to the cannery. How do you compensate the fuel-stressed, low-income Australian differently to the one who walks to work? And again, I invite a response. How do you compensate a fuel-stressed working Australian from one who lives next door to the cannery? And that's the only job they can do. Tell me how you moderate that and calculate a compensation for every Australian. I mean, I wouldn't trust any government department to be able to do that precisely. I would fear that I would not be able to build a bureaucracy large enough to do it fairly. And the only alternative is leave the vulnerable out of a scheme and find a way that targets the sectors where improvements are most likely to be made, and that's called direct action. It's pretty simple. It's a market-based mechanism. You go to the sector, you can see the emissions, you can see where world technology is going, you say, I want to purchase abatement from that sector. And that's an incentive to do something that doesn't spill over and doesn't churn. Deputy Speaker, I lament that I cannot take back to my own people a story that Australia is heading in the right direction. I'm genuinely frightened about where this carbon tax is going. There's no doubt that this government can potentially delay another year, as Mr Rudd did, and simply say we're not ready. But why not just be open and honest about how Australian families will be affected? And my greatest disappointment is not with this government, it's actually with the Australian trade union movement. I've got a lot of respect for people in the trade union movement, but not for their leaders, who blindly follow and try and resuscitate our current Prime Minister by helping her through this carbon tax debacle by intimating that members, that paid-up union members would support a carbon tax. And these glib claims that we will transform the economy and move ourselves into a post-carbon generation, and if we don't do it now, if we don't move right now, we're somehow disadvantaged. But it just stops there, and we get no more detail than that, just these glib promises of a beautiful future pulled down on a chain by Cate Blanchett. Now, I am quite happy to have Cate Blanchett saying whatever she wants to say, but when she steps from being a universally adored actress to a commentator in a party political divide, she can expect a little bit of pushback. And when I see a pensioner paid to get into an ad on TV by GetUp, who is union funded, to hide behind a 1 metre round dollar coin and say, help for paying the bills, that's why I want a carbon tax, when I hear such an incredulous statement that lacks all credibility, I can understand why the beliefs of ordinary Australians sceptical about this government moves to cynicism. And this government is very, very close to that tipping point. The budget didn't help this government one iota, and I urged them to do three things: explain the NBN, talk about the business plan, talk about the carbon tax honestly, and the way it affects working families.